everyone, I'm Nitahone, and Core Set 2019 Full Set Limited Review Week continues on my channel. I've covered all the other four colors, every single card in the other four colors in this new limited format, my initial impressions about all of them. Today we're doing green, tomorrow we'll look at the rest of the cards, the multicolored cards, the artifacts, and the lands. I also have a video about the top 10 biggest bombs coming out, a video about the best commons and uncommons coming out, as well as the archetype guide soon thereafter. So, in this video, I use a letter grade system. If you want to know more about how I come up with these letter grades and what they mean, you can find a link in the description below to a video where I explain that. Now, let's get started with the first green card in Core Set 2019, which is Blanchewood Armor. For 2 generic and a green, it is an enchantment aura at uncommon. It's an enchant creature. An enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each forest you control. This card's a fun one I actually have pretty fond memories of. I thought it was basically the best card ever in my early days of playing Magic. Obviously, it's not quite that good, but it is an aura that can provide a huge boost. It kind of pushes you towards wanting to be a little more mono-green since you need a lot of forests to really get the most out of it, and there really isn't any other reason at lower rarities to try and be mono-green, although there is one at rare that we'll get to eventually. So all in all, I think this is kind of mediocre and limited. I mean, sure, sometimes it will give like +6/+6, but other times it will give +1/+1. And there's definitely an enchantment deck in this format that will feel alright about playing this. But even there, I think there are better auras around, some of which we will see in this very video. I think this is a D, with the caveat that if you end up in the unlikely mono-green deck, it probably moves up to a C+. Next, we have Bristling Boar, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 boar at common, and it can't be blocked by more than one creature. So this has anti-menace, sort of, and doesn't like it when creatures team up to block it. That isn't irrelevant text. It means your opponent has to have a 3 power or more creature to kill it in combat, and if they don't, they just don't have a way to block it profitably. And sometimes that's going to just give you free attacks. Other times that text box won't matter at all, and it's just a 4 mana 4/3, but a 4 mana 4/3 does a decent job on the vanilla tests, and I think overall that makes this card a C. Next we have Centaur Coarser, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 Centaur warrior at common, and just flavor text in its box. This is a boring vanilla creature, but not one of the ones that falls into the D range like a lot of them do. That's because there just aren't many 3 mana 3/3s around these days. A lot of times this is going to come down on turn 3 and just be the biggest thing on the table. Those stats are good for the mana cost, and it's another solid C. Next we have Colossal Dreadmoth, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 dinosaur at common, and it has trample. I think this is a new and original card that we've never seen before. Okay, I'm kidding. It's been printed like 100 times lately, and it's the same thing it is now that it's always been, which is a solid C. A 6 mana 6/6 trampler is nice. It's a good finisher. It pairs well with stuff like Pegasus Courser that can give it flying. You know, it's just a nice creature for the mana cost, but it's still like there are better finishers around at higher rarities, but this is probably the best common finisher you'll find in a green deck. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Colossal Majesty, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. So red, as we saw yesterday, and green, as we are seeing now, have a bit of a 4 power or greater sub-theme going on, and this is another one of those to build around. I'm pretty excited to try to build around this card, and make no mistake, it's definitely a build-around card. Your average limited deck will probably not have enough ways to trigger this, like 3 or 4, and that's just not enough to want to run this thing. I think it's a straight F in most decks. However, if you can ramp and or you are playing creatures with high power at lower mana costs, this gets interesting because of the sheer advantage it grants you. It is sort of hard to build around, as you don't want a deck that's just filled with 4 power creatures, otherwise you may get run over early, but I think if you have like 7 or more cards with 4 or more power, this becomes very playable and will just win you a game because of all the cards it draws you. I'm still a little skeptical about how easy it is to build around, and as a result I'm only going to give it a C+ to represent the difficulty in building around it, but I feel like if your deck really manages to get there, it's probably even better than a C+, probably like a solid B, but getting there is not going to be that easy. I mean, I'd be happy if it was, but right now I don't think it's going to be that easy. Next, we have Daggerback Basilisk, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 Basilisk at common, and it has Death Touch. Things with Death Touch are always reasonably playable, though the 1 mana Death Touchers are ideal because you also end up trading with those and trading up. Still, this can do some trading up, though it has to make a little more effort to do so, and because of that, I think playing 1 in most green decks is just fine. It is yet another straight up C. There's been a lot of those in the early goings on this list, and here is another one. Next, we have Declare Dominance, which for 3 generic and 2 green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. All creatures able to block it this turn do so. A lot of people think this card's like incredible. Like when it was spoiled, I saw people on Reddit losing their minds about how good it was going to be in Limited. And I'm not saying it's bad in Limited, but I don't think it's like the first pickable bomb that apparently a significant portion of the community think it is. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and we've seen effects like this before. And I don't think they're terrible. It gives a creature a huge boost and forces your opponent into uncomfortable blocks. If you have like a big board in addition to whatever creature you're pumping, all those creatures have to block it, so you can hit them with your other creatures. And so there are definitely situations where it can end up being really good. But the fact is that there's a pretty decent chunk of the time you won't be able to cast it for any sort of value. If you're behind, it's pretty useless. At parity, it can be good sometimes. But if your opponent just has a big dude on their side of the board, it's still not that good, assuming you don't have more stuff going on your side of the table. If you're ahead, it will work wonders and is a great way to clear out blockers and hit your opponent for a bunch of damage. So that means it's really good in one scenario, and you just won't always be in that. As a result, I think it's just a C. It's just too clunky. I mean, you're also playing into, like, if your opponent has an instant spell, if they have mana up and a way to kill your creature in response, you are so dead because you just spent 5 mana on nothing. And yeah, sometimes this will perform like an A. You know, you'll have games where it does that, but you'll also have games where it's an F. And I think you'll have equal proportions of both. And, you know, a C sort of in the middle. I'm not saying I'm not going to run it, obviously. I gave it a C, but I don't think it's first pickable or anywhere close. I'd pick it up in the middle or later part of a pack and feel fine about it. So yeah, I think it's just a C. Next we have Druid of Horns, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/3 human druid at uncommon. Whenever you cast an aura spell that targets Druid of Horns, create a 3/3 green beast creature token. So we saw that white likes enchantments, green does too, though more specifically it likes auras. And you know, this is one of those payoffs. It gives you a nice payoff for them, since it gives you a 3/3 every time you target the druid with an aura. This helps add a ton of value, and especially makes it so that you don't get blown out quite as hard by a removal spell. Still, this is obviously a build around. It has horrible stats on the vanilla test, so you need to be packing, you know, 5-ish auras to fully take advantage. And they have to be the kind of auras you want to target your druid with, really. They can't just be, you know, you don't want to put luminous bonds on your own Druid of Horns. Although I guess there could be a corner case where you need a 3/3 beast token more than you need a 2/3. But you probably should still just be putting it on your opponent. So I think it's kind of hard to build around. I think it's an F. The reason I think in a deck that doesn't have the required number of enchantments, the reason I think it's kind of hard to build around is auras are just such a dangerous strategy in general because they can cause so much card disadvantage. There are some exceptions. There are some creatures who really like auras, including the druid here, who helps mitigate against that. But I think you need a decent number of auras, and they're not all going to be like good enough to make the cut, I don't think. But so overall, I think this is like a C+. Like if you can build around it, it'll be nice, but if you can't, it's pretty useless. Next, we have Druid of the Cowl, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 elf druid at common, and you can tap it to add green to your mana pool. We saw this not too long ago, and it was nice. It has the kind of body that can block 2 drops and also provides you with some ramp. It's no Llanowar Elves, which we just had in Dominaria, but it's not super far off either. In fact, in the later part of the game, you'd probably rather have the druid, and this is a solid playable and a C+. Next, we have Dryad Greenseeker, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 uncommon Dryad, and you can tap it to look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. I like this card a lot, and I think it's one people might be sleeping on. It is just basically a card drawing engine that happens to also be a 2-mana 1/3, which is passable in the vanilla test. And yeah, the land has to be, the card on top of your deck has to be a land to really get the card advantage, but guess what? It will be a land a significant portion of the time. It won't always be, and it won't always draw you the card, but if you play this on turn 2 and it's in play for 5 turns, it's going to draw you 2 extra cards, which is kind of insane for a 2-drop. Basically, this is going to do a bad Coarser of Crewfix impression, but a bad Coarser of Crewfix is still really good, and I think this is a B-. I think it's a first pickable uncommon, maybe even green's best uncommon in the set. Next, we have Elvish Clancaller, which is 2 green mana for a 1/1 elf druid at rare. Other elves you control get +1/+1, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 4 generic and 2 green and tap it to search your library for a card named Elvish Clancaller, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. This is sort of, I mean, it's going to be playable in limited, but it definitely has non-rotating limited formats in mind, constructed formats in mind. You know, where elves are a legitimate threat and can make a bunch of mana, so you can do crazy things like search up all your Elvish Clancallers in the same turn and just kill your opponent. But that's not going to be easy to do in this format. Getting elves in this format in general isn't exactly hard, but it isn't running rampant with them either. There are 5 of them at common and uncommon. And this is an F in your typical limited deck, which probably has between 1 and 3 elves. And if you amass enough elves, it does get better, but I'm not sure how easy it is to stuff your deck with elves in this format, since it isn't really a broadly supported theme. I'm going to give it a C+, and I think that's its ceiling. Next, we have Elvish Rejuvenator, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/1 elf druid at common. And when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you can put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tap, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This card's nice. It helps you ramp into stuff. I kind of wish it had better stats, though. I don't think it would have been broken or anything for it to be a 1/2. As is, it's obviously really bad at blocking or attacking and horrible on the vanilla test, but it does ramp you and get you a land, which is nice. Although there are going to be times, it's improbable, but there are going to be times where you play this and you don't hit a land, and that's going to feel god-awful. So I kind of wish they let you just search your library for a forest or something. But most of the time you'll hit something in the top 5. I mean, you only have a 40-card deck. I don't think you want to run this in aggressive green decks, but if you're interested in getting to higher converted mana costs as quickly as possible, you should play this, and it's going to be pretty good. I think it's a C+. Next, we have Gasp Twins, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 tree folk at uncommon. It has trample, and it can block an additional creature each combat. This is another finisher. It's not a great one. I don't think it is a whole lot better than Colossal Dreadmoth as a finisher, since it costs 1 more and only has 1 more power and toughness. But it can do double duty, and that's kind of nice. If you're behind and you play this, the fact that it can block 2 creatures and probably kill both of them with the kind of stats it has will come in handy. Still, it is a 7-drop. That isn't that scary, and I think it's just another C. Next, we have Girapur Guide, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 uncommon elf scout, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 2 generic and a green to make it so a creature you control can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less this turn. This is a recent reprint from Kaladesh, where it was a fine 3-drop, but not more than that. The ability on this doesn't always actually do something, so 3 mana for it kind of is steep. Granted, there are a lot of games where it basically says target creature is unblockable, but there is a lot of variance on just how good this is. I think it's worth noting that the blue-green archetype sort of seems to be about making creatures harder to block, and so this sort of fits into that probably the best because that deck is interested in doing it. But it's a fine 3-drop in basically any green deck, but don't expect it to be a whole lot more than that. I don't like taking it early, and it's a fine playable, but I think it's just a C. Lots of C's. Next, we have Giant Spider, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/4 common spider with reach. This card has been, in my estimation, in 1 million different limited formats, and it is always serviceable but unexciting. A 4-mana 2/4 is a little below what you want stats-wise, but the reach is great and can shut down a lot of flyers. I think playing one of these in your main board will happen a lot in green decks, and you'll feel fine about it, and that means it's a C. Next, we have Gift of Paradise, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon aura. It has enchant land, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. And that land can now tap and add 2 mana of any one color. Mana fixing always has a place, and this recent reprint brings it. One of the nice things about Gifts of Paradise is that it can even help you splash double-colored cards. There isn't really any other fixing in the format that's going to allow for that. The life gain on this isn't bad either, as it sort of buys you time to durdle around playing this enchantment if you can gain a bit of life at the same time. I think this will be a key card to enable green decks to just start taking whatever cards they want from packs, which is usually something green is good at. I like it a decent amount because of the flexibility it gives you, but I still don't foresee wanting to take it super early. It's a C+. Next, we have Gigantosaurus, which for 5 green mana, that's right, all 5 are colored, green mana, you have a rare dinosaur who is a 10/10 and no text other than that. A 5-mana 10/10 does an incredible job in the vanilla test, but let's be real, this is an F in 95, maybe 99% of the decks in the format. Your deck has to be super green, like mono green or almost mono green, for this to be playable, and that's pretty hard to pull off in limited because usually one color just isn't open enough for you to do that, and making yourself do that just because you have a Gigantosaurus really isn't worth it. It still dies to a lot of removal. I'm going to give this an F to scare people away from trying to shove this into their 10 forest deck, with the caveat that if your deck is mono green and green was really open and you have like 15 forests in it at least, you should play it, but that's not going to happen very often. Next, we have Gore Claw, Terror of Calcisma, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 legendary creature bear at rare. And it says creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and whenever it attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. I like this guy a lot. While it is something of a build around, your average deck is going to have a few 4-power creatures to make this guy worth it, and he's already a 4-mana 4/3 that when he attacks becomes a 4-mana 5/4 with trample. That alone would be a playable good card. So, you don't even have to be reducing the cost of other cards. You don't even have to have other 4-power creatures for it to really be taking advantage of how good it is. Obviously, he gets insane the more of that you can do, and red-green is probably the most likely place where you can pull this off. But he's good even on his own, even in a vacuum. I mean, a 4 mana 4/3 that is a 5/4 trample when it attacks is a pretty good card. And decreasing the cost of your future 4-power creatures and giving them a mini overrun effect is just gravy. I think he's a solid B and very first pickable. Next, we have Greenwood Sentinel, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 elf scout with vigilance at common. Adding vigilance to small creatures is never very exciting. We've seen it several times recently. It's nice that it can take part in a big attack and hang back and block as well, I guess. But because it's so small, your opponent can just block it and kill it probably, so you don't have the blocker. I don't know. I think this is just barely an upgrade over at Grizzly Bears, and I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Highland Game, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/1 elk at common, and when it dies, you gain 2 life. Another pretty unexciting 2-drop. 2 mana 2/1s need to do something interesting to get out of the D range, and this does just enough to, I think, get out of being a D+. Gaining 2 life, is a little bit of value. You could also, usually black-white's really where you want to be gaining life, but you could end up in a green-white or a green-black deck where the life gain actually matters too. I mean, and this is a card that I think is actually decent out of the sideboard against super aggressive decks, because trading with one of their 2-drops and gaining 2 life goes a long way to keeping you alive long enough to win the game. But overall, I think it is a C-. Next, we have Hungary Hydro, which for X generic mana and a green is a rare Hydra. It's a 0/0. Enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. It can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, and whenever it's dealt damage, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. This is scary. It's very difficult to kill with anything that doesn't say destroy or exile, as it just gets huge very quickly. You don't really want to play it super early because it's vulnerable, but playing this for like 5 mana seems like a good place to start, where your opponent will just have a horrible time with it. Attacking into it is a nightmare, blocking it is a nightmare, and all of that makes this pretty great. And it is vulnerable to like Luminous Bonds and aura-based removal spells, so it's not like it's impossible to kill, but it's the kind of thing that if you play it, even as a 4/4 or something, even as a 3/3, that can just take over the game. It'll completely warp the game when you play it. Your opponent has to find a way to stop it. You can even put auras on this that give it trample. There are a few of those, and that would be especially scary. Overall, I think this is a straight-up bomb. I think you first pick it a significant portion of the time. I think it's an A-. Next, we have Naturalized, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant that says destroy target artifact or enchantment. So this is green's quintessential sideboard card. There aren't enough targets to really want to be mainboarding this, so I think the sideboard's really where you want to start it usually. It's probably a D+ in your main board. You can run it there if you're really desperate, but like a C+ out of the side. Ideally, you have one of these every time you draft a green deck to bring in out of your sideboard. Next, we have Oaken Form, which for 2 generic and a green is a common aura. It's an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +3/+3. So this gives an okay stats boost for the mana, but I think steering clear of this aura is the right thing to do most of the time. It doesn't add an evasive ability or replace itself, and that makes me less interested in it. There are a few ways in this format to overcome the danger of 2-for-1s with auras, and because of that, I think this is a little better than it would be in your typical format, where I'd probably just give it a straight D. I'll give it a D+ here. Next, we have Palaka Worm, which for 4 generic and 3 green is a 7/7 worm at rare. It has trample. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 7 life, and when it dies, you draw a card. So Palaka Worm was an uncommon a few times before this set, and it was basically the best uncommon in the set, or at least in the conversation every time. So I think moving it up to rare was probably a good idea. It's an incredibly powerful card, and has exactly the kind of impact you want to see when you play a 7-mana creature. It comes with good stats, an evasive keyword ability. It gains you life so that it can make sure you stick around, and even if your opponent kills it somehow, you draw a card. So basically, in a worst-case scenario, he eats a removal spell, gains you 7 life, and draws you a card. And there are plenty of times where he will just destroy the opponent. This card can get you ahead from being behind thanks to all that text, and I think it is something you first pick. Green, as we have seen, is capable of ramping, so playing a 7-drop isn't too far-fetched. I'm going to give it a B+. Next, we have Plummet, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant that says destroy target creature with flying. So this is the classic flying hate sideboard card that green always gets. It can be run mainboard in a desperate situation. Most decks will have a target or two for it, but it's probably a D there. It's the kind of sideboard card like Naturalized that you are always happy to have one of. And as a result, I think it's a C+ out of your sideboard. Next, we have Prodigious Growth, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a rare aura with enchant creature. An enchanted creature gets +7/+7 and has trample. So this is what you want to be putting on your Vine Mare. We'll get to that card later, but that's going to be a crazy thing to happen in this format. Overall, though, I don't think this is very good. 6 mana is a ton, and yeah, this makes any creature a threat. 6 mana is a ton, and yes, this makes any creature a threat, but if I'm playing a 6 mana aura in my deck, I better have hexproof or other ways to take advantage of enchantments, which to be fair, green-white does have. We've already seen some of that. This is because it is so easy to blow someone out when they put this on their creature. A removal spell is a 2-for-1 and basically a time walk with the amount of mana you have to pay for this. I think it will be playable in some corner cases, like when you get 2 or more vine mares. It's a creature with hexproof. We'll talk about it later. But I think it's dangerous to play this for the most part. I'm going to give it a C-. Next we have Rabid Bite, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. This is a great removal spell for green, just like it was last time we saw it. Keep in mind that this card doesn't actually fight your creature. Your creature just punches one of your opponent's creatures in the face. Ideally, your deck has some beefy guys in it to really take advantage. But even killing their 3/3 with like a 4/4 is a good deal here. You do have to really pay attention to when your opponent has mana up when you can cast this, though, as you open yourself up to all kinds of blowouts if they have mana for a pump or removal spell in response. Still, I think this will be premium removal again, and probably green's best common, which means it's a B- and a reasonable first pick. It's also sort of a sneakier, like 4 power or greater payoff card. It's good even if you don't have a lot of 4 power, but it is a card that's good in the deck that cares about 4 power for obvious reasons. Next we have Reclamation Sage, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/1 elf shaman at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. This hasn't been a super main boardable card in the past, and I don't think it will be here either. There just aren't enough artifacts and enchantments to think you will also have targets for it all the time. So it will mount to being a 3 mana 2/1 a sufficient portion of the time. Still, there are a decent number of targets running around, so this may be about a C- in your main board, I guess. That said, it's very flexible in dealing with 2 different card types, and as a result, it is a great sideboard card that in an ideal world, you'll always have one of. I think it's a B- out of your sideboard. I think it's way better than naturalized, because obviously this will be a 2-for-1 a significant amount of the time. Next, we have Recollect, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. Lets you return target card from your graveyard to your hand. I'm never a huge fan of these effects. They don't impact the board at all, and the payoff for them is usually minimal. That said, Recollect can be good if your deck has several bombs in it or creatures with enter the battlefield triggers. But guess what? Your deck was already good because it has several bombs in it, and I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Rocksoracle, which for 4 generic and a green is a Rhino Monk at common. It's a 4/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. This is a nice common. A 4/2 Elvish Visionary is kind of nice because it can trade for so many different things. Sure, the 2 toughness isn't great, but being able to block and kill X4s with a creature who already drew you a card is good. I feel like I will be happy to have a couple of these in most of my green decks, and I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Root Snare, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. So this is awful. Fog is already a terrible card in limited, and this one costs 2 mana instead of 1. So yeah, it's unplayable. Fog effects just aren't worth a card in any format, and you basically are just giving yourself card disadvantage every time you play this. You might as well be mulliganing to 6. So yeah, it's an F. The only place where fogs can sort of be worth bringing in out of your sideboard is against decks that really go wide and try to kill you with Trumpet Blast or Inspiring Charge. But I can tell you, based on past formats, Root Snare will probably get sided in like once across 40 drafts. It just isn't a reliable sideboard card at all. Next, we have Runic Armosaurus. For 1 generic and 2 green is a 2/5 dinosaur at rare, and whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or land that isn't a mana ability, you may draw a card. 3 mana 2/5 is nice on the vanilla test, and this comes with a bit of upside. Most opponents are going to have a handful of activated abilities in their decks, and I think you'll draw a card with this sometimes, but most of the time it'll just be a 3 mana 2/5. I think it's a C+ overall. Next, we have Scapeshift, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a mythic sorcery. You can sacrifice any number of lands, search your library for up to that many land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This is a nice reprint for modern players and will probably be worth some money, so considering taking it for that reason is probably worthwhile. However, in terms of playability, there's no reason to play this card in limited 99% of the time. If you are desperate for fixing, this can do it, but it isn't actually that good at helping you fix, so it is the kind of fixing you run out of desperation, and because it is worth so much, you're never going to get it as late as you should. Probably want to take it for fixing. The reason it's not that good for fixing is because of how much mana it costs, basically. Sure, if you have like a crazy 4 or 5 color deck, this could sort of be the glue that keeps it together, but most of the time, I just think that's a dangerous route to take. I think it's just an F. Next, we have Talons of Wildwood, which for 1 generic and a green is an aura at common, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has trample, and you can pay 2 generic and a green to return it from your graveyard to your hand. So this is basically a really bad Rancor, but guess what? Rancor is ridiculous. So even being compared to it is a nice place to be. The initial boost it gives isn't anything special, but the fact that you can keep bringing it back from your graveyard is nice. It helps sort of mitigate the fact that you're getting 2 for 1 over and over again. And in decks that get triggers every time they play an enchantment or aura, this is going to be a card that really powers up that deck. Overall, I'm fairly high on this card as far as auras go, which still means that you don't want to take it early or anything. You do still have to invest a total of 5 mana, like every time you get it back from your graveyard, but I think it's a solid C. Next, we have Thorn Lieutenant, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/3 rare elf warrior, and when it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 5 generic and a green, and it gets +4/+4 until end of turn. Obviously, a 2-mana 2/3 does really well in the vanilla test, and the fact that it leaves behind a 1/1, even if your opponent kills it, isn't bad at all. Having the additional ability to get huge in the late game is obviously also good. Basically, this is a 2-drop that is good no matter what is going on in the game. It helps in most game states, and I like that a lot. I think this is good enough to be a first pick, and feel pretty good about it. I think it's a B. Next, we have Thornhide Wolves, which for 4 generic and a green are a 4/5 wolf at common. Last time we saw this, it sort of overperformed. I think I gave it a D, and it was a little better than that. Turns out 4/5 is some decent stats for blocking and attacking at that stage of the game. It can grind the board to a screeching halt against a really aggressive deck sometimes. It isn't great or ideal, don't get me wrong, but I think it's like a C-. Next, we have Titanic Growth, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. This is a nice combat trick, but it's still a combat trick that comes with a lot of inherent risk and requires your opponent to play into it to actually take an opponent's creature away. It's a solid C. You'll play one in most of your green decks that have 15 or more creatures, but you probably don't want more than one. Next, we have Vigilant Baloth, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 beast at uncommon with vigilance. This is a powerful green creature that does a great job on the vanilla test. 5 mana 5/5s are already pretty good in limited, and this one comes with vigilance, which is always nice on a big creature who can wreak havoc on both offense and defense. I think your average green deck would feel pretty good having like 2 of these, and I think it's first pickable in weak packs, meaning it's like a B-. Next, we have Vine Mare, a card I've mentioned a few times. For 2 generic and 2 green, it is a 5/3 elemental horse at uncommon. It has hexproof, and it can't be blocked by black creatures. So yeah, I mentioned this earlier when talking about auras. Lately, Wizards has really liked printing a creature at common or uncommon with hexproof. They don't usually have great stats on their own, but they're a great place to put auras, and this actually has the best stats of any of the ones we've seen lately, at least as far as efficiency goes. A 4 mana 5/3 does fine on the vanilla test, and adding hexproof to it and the fact that it can't be blocked by black creatures is just, makes it really insane. A lot of games are going to be lost to an aura being put on this horse, that's for sure. Also, that high power synergizes pretty well with the few cards that like creatures to have power 4 or higher. I still think it's held to like a C+ with the caveat that if your deck has auras in it, it goes up a significant amount. Like I said, you're going to lose games and you're going to win games where you just put an aura on Vine Mare and your opponent just can't stop it. Next, we have Vivienne Reed, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a legendary planeswalker Vivienne at Mythic, has 5 loyalty when it comes into play. Its +1 says, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Its -3 says, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. You get an emblem that says, creatures you control get +2/+2 and have vigilance, trample, and indestructible. Vivienne is good, but not great. She does come down with 5 loyalty, but both her +1 and -3 are sort of underwhelming. She won't always have a target for the -3, so it may as well not be there sometimes. It would have been sweet if they added land to it at least, but I guess they really don't want things blowing up lands. And her +1 is nice for drawing cards. That's going to be a good way to just sort of win a game just by drawing all these extra cards off of Vivienne, but she doesn't protect herself at all. I mean, I guess she can kill flyers, which, flyers often threaten planeswalkers, but she needs you to have some board presence to really thrive, where she will just start drawing you cards and drawing you creatures who can then protect her, sort of indirectly protecting herself. I'm not trying to say she's bad, but she's not a planeswalker who pulls you ahead when you're behind. You're still going to be behind when you play her. If you're at parity or ahead of your opponent, she does come out pretty well, basically drawing you cards and threatening to turn your board into something frightening. I do think she's first pickable, but honestly, I would take premium removal over her, and I'm going to give her a B-. Next, we have Vivian's Invocation, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a rare. It says, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest of them on the bottom of your library in a random order. When a creature is put onto the battlefield this way, it deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. I like Vivian's Invocation more than I like Vivienne herself. It does require some setup, but honestly, even if you cast this and get a 3/3 and kill their 3/3 with it, that's a pretty good return for 7 mana. You might also get to put a 7/7 into play that kills something. Basically, your deck does probably need a decent number of biggish creatures for this to be good, but I think the average limited deck in green will have enough big creatures that this is going to be worth it, and especially because this looks at the top 7 cards of your library. I think it's a solid B. It's a powerful removal spell that might also let you cheat a huge creature into play, and there's not much wrong with that to me. It's always a 2-for-1, basically. And the last green card we have to look at is Wall of Vines. For 1 green mana, it is a 0/3 plant wall at common. It has Defender and it has Reach. I don't really like walls that don't really do anything, and this one doesn't really do anything. It does get bonus points for Reach, but I'd rather have a giant spider than this in basically all situations. I think it's a D-, and I hope to never find myself having to run it. Tomorrow, I'll be back with my review of all the multicolored artifacts and land cards in Core Set 2019. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Don't forget to subscribe so you can see future Core Set 2019 limited content, including more videos on the limited format itself, and in a few weeks, actual draft videos of the format. Thanks for watching.